This is part 10 of our series through the Godot 4 documentation. Please be sure to like and subscribe if you enjoy educational content like this. Do you ever feel incapacitated by the sheer endless possibilities? One thing you can and should do is try to work on is always having an entry point. This gives you a launching point to follow the logic down. Think about if you are writing a story. You'd typically not want to start in the middle. A game should always have a sort of entry point, somewhere that you, the developer, can definitively track where things begin so that you can follow the logic as it continues elsewhere. This place also serves as a bird's-eye view of all of the other data and logic in the program. For traditional applications, this would be the main function. In this case, it would be a main node. You can think of this entry node, which is typically called main.gd, node being the primary controller of your game. Then one has their actual in-game world, which doesn't matter if it is a 2D or 3D one. This can be a child of main. In addition, one will need a primary GUI for their game that manages the various menus and widgets the project needs. If you want to change levels with code structured like this, you would only need to switch the child level node. Here is my shoddy implementation of how I approach this, based on work that was mostly done for me. On entering the door, we instantiate the next level and add it as a child of the main node. Then we remove the current level, which is level 1 in this case. And then, I made a bubblegum and duct tape solution of just removing the player from the level 2, as level 1's player remains active. This is not normally good practice. I just didn't feel like restructuring the whole project. You should, though, in practice. This temporary solution will cause problems. You know what? Just ignore this line of code. And lastly, we delete ourselves, since we are the ones making all of this happen, and level 2 is the end of the game. If we look at remote in the scene doc, we can see the swap happen as we pass through the door. This method will work well if you have a game that is getting large. However, if your game was small, consider the following. Consider what gameplay systems one's project requires. If one has a system that 1. Tracks all of its data internally. 2. Should be globally accessible. 3. Should exist in isolation. Then one should create an autoload singleton node. You can do that by going to Project Settings. Clicking on the autoload tab and setting a node that you want to be accessible from anywhere in your code. With a game like this, a simpler alternative with less control would be to have a game singleton that simply calls the scenetree.changeScene to file method to swap out the main scene's content. This structure more or less keeps the world as the main game node. However, while the documentation suggests to use a string, I would preferably use a packed scene type as the example on screen does. Strings can get a bit messy sometimes. Any GUI would need to also be a singleton, be a transitory part of the world, or be manually added as a direct child of the root. Otherwise, the GUI nodes would also delete themselves during scene transitions. If one has systems that modify other systems' data, one should define those as their own scripts or scenes rather than autoloads. Please see the documentation for further information about this. Each system in your game should essentially be its own tree. Don't use parent-child relationships where children are not effectively elements of their parents. Does removing the parent reasonably mean that one should also remove the children? If not, then it should have its own place in the hierarchy as a sibling or some other relation. In some cases, one needs these separated nodes to also position themselves relative to each other. One can use the remote transform 2D nodes for this purpose. They will allow a target node to conditionally inherit selected transform elements from the remote node. To assign the target node path, use one of the following. 1. A reliable third party, likely a parent node, to mediate the assignment. 2. A group to easily pull a reference to the desired node, assuming there will only ever be one of the targets. A good example of when this situation might happen is in a first-person shooter game. The player might be carrying a weapon. Another might be if you are changing rooms, which we have seen. However, what if the player is part of the level? The example I showed you was a bit simple. This is a subjective matter. The dilemma arises when one must micromanage when a node must move around the scene tree to preserve itself. For example, you add a player node to a room. Then you need to change rooms, so one must delete the current room. Before the room can be deleted, one must preserve and/or move the player. You've done this, but is memory a concern? If not, one can just create the two rooms, move the player, and delete the old one. No problem. But if it is, one will need to move the player somewhere else in the tree. Delete the room. Instantiate and add the new room. Then re-add the player. The key to scene organization is to consider the scene tree in relational terms rather than spatial terms. Are the nodes dependent on their parent's existence? If not, then they can thrive all by themselves somewhere else. If they are dependent, then it stands to reason that they should be children of that parent, and likely part of that parent's scene if they aren't already. Does this mean nodes themselves are components? Not at all. Godot's node trees form an aggregation relationship, not one of composition. But while one still has the flexibility to move nodes around, it is still best when such moves are unnecessary by default. And that will do it for this video. If you enjoyed this content, please like the video and subscribe to the channel. And thanks for making it all the way through the video. Please join us in the next one.